April 1955. The voice in the journal was steady, deliberate. The handwriting, when she would eventually see it, pressed hard into the page the way a man presses his name into wet concrete because he wants it to last. I began work on the municipal water system today. The council voted 6-1 to approve the project. Mayor Harlan shook my hand on the courthouse steps and said this town has been waiting 20 years for clean water. I told him we'd have it running by fall. My name is Walter Briggs, and I am the new water commissioner of Colton. Then the voice stopped. And in its place, the sound of a Honda Civic coughing twice, rattling once, and dying completely on the gravel shoulder of Route 11 in the flat farm country of central Illinois on a Tuesday afternoon in September of 2016. Nora Briggs Calloway sat with her hands on the wheel and stared at the check engine light that had been glowing since June. She turned the key. Nothing. She turned it again. Less than nothing. The engine didn't even attempt the courtesy of a struggle. It had simply decided with the quiet finality of something that had made up its mind long before she had that it was done. She was 20 years old. She had $57 in her jacket pocket. She had a duffel bag in the back seat that held everything she owned in the world, which wasn't much. 2 changes of clothes, a rain poncho, a tarp folded into a square the size of a phone book, a jar of peanut butter, half a sleeve of crackers, and a small olive green tin that had once belonged to her grandmother Ruth. The tin held a sewing kit. Needles thread a thimble, a measuring tape, a photograph of Ruth tucked inside the lid. Nora had carried that tin through every shelter, every group home, every car she'd slept in since she was 14 years old. And Ruth had died on a Tuesday afternoon, and the world had quietly rearranged itself into a place where there was no longer any room made specifically for her. Route 11 stretched in both directions through flat country, corn stubble, fence posts. The September sky was wide and pale and offered nothing. She grabbed the duffel and the tin and locked the car out of habit, even though there was nothing left inside worth stealing, and she started walking. The sign at the edge of the road said Colton 2 miles. She had never heard of it. The September sun was dropping fast, and the air had that particular quality that comes in the first days of fall in the Midwest, not cold yet, but carrying the memory of cold, the suggestion of what was coming whether you were ready or not. Nora was not ready. She had been not ready for 2 years, ever since the state of Illinois had processed her 18th birthday with the same institutional efficiency it applied to everything else, and informed her, through a social worker whose name she had already forgotten, that she was no longer a ward of the system, that she was, in the language they used, an independent adult. She had $23 that day and the clothes on her back and a tin sewing kit that had belonged to her grandmother. 2 years later, she had $57 and a broken car in the same tin. The road was quiet. A truck passed and didn't slow down. A crow sat on a fence post and watched her walk by with the flat evaluating stare of something that had seen worse. She kept walking. Her boots were good boots, at least work boots she had found at a Salvation Army in Decatur 8 months ago, a size too big but broken in now, the leather darkened at the toes. Ruth had always said you could tell the quality of a person's character by whether they took care of their shoes. Ruth had taken care of everything. She had worked 2 cleaning jobs for 10 years to keep their apartment, and she had taught Nora to fix things with her hands because the landlord wouldn't, and she had died quietly in her bedroom on a Tuesday afternoon while Nora was in 7th grade learning fractions that she would never use. Nora didn't let herself think about Ruth too often. It was the kind of thinking that went nowhere useful. Colton appeared the way small towns in flat country always appeared, slowly, then all at once. A water tower on the horizon first, then a church steeple, then rooftops spreading out beneath a thickening sky. Main Street was 4 blocks long. A diner with a hand-painted sign that said Rosie's. A hardware store with a display of rakes and shovels in the window. A post office. A barber shop with a closed sign in the door. The smell of fried onions drifted from the diner, and her stomach contracted with the specific misery of being hungry near food she couldn't afford to buy. She had eaten half a gas station sandwich at noon. She was saving the other half. At the end of Main Street, the county courthouse sat back from the road behind a parking lot full of pickup trucks and folding chairs. A flatbed trailer was parked at the edge of the lot, and a man with a microphone and a clipboard stood on it, his voice carrying across the September air with the particular authority of someone who sold things for a living. Lot 11, he called out. John Deere Mower, 1982, runs on a good day, starting at $40. Do I hear 40 a county surplus auction? Nora had seen them before. Cities and counties selling off whatever the budget no longer had room for equipment. Vehicles foreclosed parcels of land that nobody wanted to maintain. She had drifted through one in Springfield 2 years ago, not to buy anything, but because it was something to do, somewhere to stand, without anyone asking her to move along. She walked toward the edge of the crowd now for the same reason. It was something to watch while she figured out where she was going to sleep tonight. The lots came and went. A tractor sold for $300 to a man in a seed cap who looked like he had been waiting specifically for that tractor for 20 years. A shipping container went for $80 to a woman with a truck. Someone paid $250 for a box truck the auctioneer openly admitted had transmission trouble, and the buyer looked quietly pleased as if he knew something about that transmission that the auctioneer didn't. Then the auctioneer shuffled his clipboard and something in his posture shifted. Not much, just a degree or two in the direction of amusement, the way a man's face changes when he's about to tell a joke he already knows the punchline to. Lot 14, he said, half-acre parcel on the east side of town, formerly the site of the Colton Municipal Water Tower. Tower collapsed during the storm of April 2016. Parcel includes the foundation, all remaining debris, and whatever wildlife's decided to move in since. Starting bid $5. Nobody moved. A few people in the crowd looked at each other with the particular sideways expression that means we all understand this is absurd. Someone laughed low and brief. An older man near the front shook his head with the slow certainty of someone who has seen too many bad deals to be surprised by another one. Come on, folks, the auctioneer said. $5. You spend more than that on coffee. Silence. He raised his gavel. Going once, going. $5, Nora said. She hadn't planned to say it. The words came out before the thought was fully formed, which was the way most of the decisions in her life had arrived. Not reasoned through, but felt the way you feel the edge of something in the dark before you see it. Every head in the crowd turned toward her. She was aware of what they saw. A young woman who had been walking for 2 miles and looked like it. Dirt on her jeans from the car. Hair pulled back with the specific practicality of someone who doesn't own a mirror. A duffel bag over one shoulder and an expression that gave nothing away, because giving things away was a habit she had trained herself out of years ago. The auctioneer blinked. We have $5. Do I hear 10 silence? Just silence and the sound of the September wind moving through the corn stubble beyond the edge of town. Sold, he said, and brought the gavel down with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Lot 14 to the young lady in the back. See the clerk for paperwork. The man in the seed cap leaned toward his wife. She just bought a pile of junk, he said, not bothering to lower his voice. His wife shook her head. Poor thing. Nora didn't look at either of them. She walked to the clerk's table where a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain was already pulling out the paperwork for Lot 14. She processed the $5 bill with the same brisk efficiency she would have applied to any transaction had Nora signed 3 forms and handed her a folded property deed. East on Maple, the clerk said, past the grain elevator right on Tower Road. She paused. You can't miss it. She paused again differently this time. Well, you can't miss what's left of it. Nora folded the deed and put it in her jacket pocket alongside the $52 she had left. She walked east. The sun was nearly gone by the time she turned off Maple onto Tower Road, a dirt track that ran straight and narrow through the edge of town toward nothing visible. She followed it for a quarter mile, the light going copper and then rust, and then the particular gray-blue that arrives just before dark, and then she saw it. The lot was surrounded by a chain-link fence with a gate hanging open on one hinge, as if whatever authority had once cared about keeping it closed had given up on the project. Inside the fence, the half-acre looked like the aftermath of something enormous. Twisted steel beams lay scattered across the ground like the bones of a creature that had fallen mid-stride. The cylindrical water tank had split open along one side and toppled, lying on its flank in the weeds with the split face pointing east. Chunks of concrete were everywhere, some of them the size of a car, others broken down to rubble. Weeds had come up through all of it, tall, determined, the kind that grow where nothing else will bother. The foundation was still there. She could see it through the wreckage, a massive concrete slab 30 feet or more across, anchored to the earth, with rusted steel bolts around its perimeter. Whatever had stood on it was gone, but the thing itself remained flat and solid, unchanged. Nora stood at the open gate for a moment and looked at the lot in the last of the evening light. It was a wreck. It was a genuine spectacular wreck with no utilities, no shelter, no water, no path forward that she could see from where she was standing. But the fence gave privacy. The concrete wall on the north side of the foundation, a section that had broken off and fallen at an angle, created a natural windbreak about 4 feet high. The ground was flat. She had a tarp. She stepped through the gate and dropped her duffel bag on the concrete slab. Then she heard it. A sound from inside the fallen tank, low, intermittent, a kind of pressed-down whimper. The sound of something that had learned that louder sounds brought worse results. Nora went still. She scanned the ground around her feet and found a section of rebar about 2 feet long and picked it up slowly, holding it the way her grandmother had told her to hold a flashlight in a dark hallway, firmly without tension ready. She moved toward the opening in the split tank. The last horizontal light of the day came through the gap in the steel and she saw it. A dog. A German shepherd, or what had been a German shepherd before hunger had worked on it for what looked like several weeks. The fur was matted and gray with dust. The ribs were visible. The dog lay curled against the interior wall of the fallen tank chin on the concrete floor, watching her with dark eyes that held neither aggression nor hope, just the careful, exhausted attention of something that had learned to wait. "Hey," Nora said. Her voice came out softer than she intended. "Hey, it's okay." The dog didn't move, didn't growl, just watched. She set the rebar down on the ground beside her slowly, without making a production of it. Then she reached into the outer pocket of her duffel and pulled out the other half of the gas station sandwich she'd been saving since noon, turkey and Swiss on bread that had gone slightly stale. She unwrapped it, set it on the concrete just inside the tank opening, and backed away 6 feet. The dog watched her back away. Then it waited a full minute still and assessing before it finally moved. It stood on legs that trembled with the effort, and she saw that the front left leg was carrying less weight than it should. It limped forward in a straight line to the sandwich and ate it in 3 bites without looking up. When it finished, it looked at her. She looked at it. "You live here," she said. The dog's tail moved once, a single measured motion, like a statement rather than a greeting. "Yeah," Nora said, "me too, I guess." She built camp in the dark, working by feel, in the weak light of a disposable lighter she kept in her jacket pocket. She unfolded the tarp and anchored 2 corners with chunks of broken concrete, propped the other 2 sides up at an angle against the section of wall on the north end of the foundation. It wasn't a shelter so much as a statement of intent, but it would cut the wind, and the September nights in central Illinois were cold enough now that wind mattered. The dog, which she had already started thinking of as Scout because it kept circling the perimeter of the lot in slow, deliberate loops, as if maintaining a patrol schedule, settled about 10 feet from her tarp and watched her work. She didn't try to pet it. She didn't talk to it more than necessary. She had learned from years of foster placements and group homes that both dogs and people settled faster when you didn't demand anything of them too soon. By the time she lay down on the concrete with her jacket folded under her head, the stars were out. She had grown up in cities, group homes and shelters in Decatur and Springfield and Peoria, where the sky at night was a pale orange, nothing light pollution, erasing everything above the level of the street lamps. She had never seen stars like this, not scattered or occasional, but dense layered, the Milky Way visible as an actual structure, a thing with depth and weight. She lay on her back on a concrete slab in a wrecked lot in a town she'd never heard of this morning, and looked up at more sky than she had ever seen in her life. She did not cry. She had not cried in a long time. Crying required a kind of energy she had learned to redirect. But she stayed awake for a while looking at the stars, and at some point, Scout inched forward across the concrete, and by the time she finally slept, the dog was pressed against her side, thin and warm and present. The first 3 days were about the simplest possible things, water and food and not stopping. She found a public restroom behind the courthouse that was unlocked during business hours. She filled 2 plastic bottles at the sink every morning and carried them back to the lot. She stretched her remaining money across the 3 days with the discipline of someone who had done this math before: a loaf of bread at the gas station, 2 miles down Route 11, a jar of peanut butter, 2 cans of soup. She ate cold because she had no way to heat them. For Scout, a bag of the cheapest dry dog food on the shelf, which the dog ate with a focus so complete and so serious that it was almost difficult to watch. And she worked. She cleared rubble. She dragged steel beams to the fence line, lining them up against the chain link in rough order of size, because order was something her hands understood even when her mind was occupied with survival. She stacked broken concrete in sorted piles. She pulled weeds from the surface of the foundation slab by their roots, methodically starting at the north end and working south. She didn't have a plan beyond making the space livable. But she had her hands, and she had the habit of using them. Ruth had taught her that. When everything else falls apart, Ruth used to say, you use your hands. Thinking gets you in trouble. Your hands know what to do. On the second day, she found that the collapsed section of wall on the north side of the lot, the one she'd been using as a windbreak, was actually in better condition than it looked from a distance. The concrete was intact. It had fallen in one piece during the storm rather than crumbling, and it sat at nearly the right angle to form the back wall of something more permanent than a tarp. She noted this without quite knowing what she was noting it for. On the third day, she was moving a section of collapsed steel paneling with a length of pipe she'd found at the fence line, using the pipe as a lever, the way Ruth had taught her: work smarter than the weight, not harder than it, when she became aware that she was being watched. Not by Scout, who was occupied with something interesting near the east fence. By someone else. She straightened and turned. A man was standing at the gate. He was somewhere in his early 70s, she thought, tall, with a kind of frame that had been bigger in its prime and hadn't entirely given that up. White hair under a canvas work cap, a face that had spent decades in weather. He wore a flannel shirt tucked into work pants, and he carried a metal toolbox in one hand, holding it the way a man carries something he's carried for a long time, without thinking about the weight. He wasn't exactly staring, he was observing. There was a difference that she could feel from 20 feet away. How long have you been standing there? She asked. He considered this. 3 days, he said. Give or take. She looked at him. I live about a quarter mile that direction, he said, and nodded east toward a small farmhouse barely visible through the tree line. You can see this lot from my kitchen window. He set the toolbox down just inside the gate. My name is Jack Pruitt. Nora waited. You've been clearing this lot for 3 days, he said. The way you sorted that steel heavy pieces to the fence line lighter material toward the center so you can work outward. He paused. That's not random. That's a system. My grandmother taught me, Nora said. He nodded slowly. The way a man nods when something confirms what he already suspected. She taught you right. He looked at the foundation slab, scanning it the way she had seen experienced people look at a work site, not just at what was there, but at what could be done with it. His eyes moved in a pattern she recognized because she used it herself. What's your plan for the foundation? He asked. I don't have one yet. He nodded again. That's honest. He didn't say anything else for a moment. He just stood at the gate, looking at the lot with his toolbox at his feet, and Nora realized that he wasn't waiting to be invited in. He was waiting to see what she would do with the silence. She turned back to the steel paneling and got her pipe under it again. If you're going to use a lever on that piece, he said, you want to pivot from the far end, not the near one. Changes the mechanical advantage. She stopped. She looked at the paneling. She looked at where the pipe was positioned. She moved the fulcrum point 18 inches to the right. Pushed. The panel shifted with a fraction of the effort it had been requiring. She looked at him. He picked up his toolbox and walked into the lot. His name was Jack Pruitt, and he was 72 years old, and he had been a carpenter for 43 years before his right knee decided on his behalf that 43 was enough. He had built houses and barns and school additions and one church in Danforth that he mentioned only once, and with the careful pride of a man who doesn't want to seem like he's bragging, but wants you to know it was good work. His wife, Carol, had died of pancreatic cancer 2 years ago. She had been sick for 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end, and he said this in the same tone you might use to describe the weather factual, already absorbed the grief, settled into the structure of him rather than sitting on top. He didn't volunteer any of this immediately. It came out over the course of that first afternoon in the incremental way that information passes between people who are working beside each other, not in conversation so much as between tasks, in the small gaps between efforts. He was not there to help her. He was there because he had watched her for 3 days and determined that she wasn't going to quit, and he had decided that was worth something. There was a difference. She recognized it, and she felt easier for recognizing it. He showed her how to use a framing square to check the corner angles of the concrete wall section she'd identified as structurally sound. He showed her how to read the foundation slab, where the rebar was running underneath based on the pattern of anchor bolts at the perimeter. He showed her that the concrete was poured in sections, which was standard, and that the sections were slightly differentiated in color, which told you when they'd been poured relative to each other. He did not ask her how old she was, where she'd come from, where she'd been sleeping, or whether she had a plan. She noticed this as she would have noticed a physical sensation with awareness, and was something that wasn't quite gratitude, but was in the same neighborhood. Scouts circled the perimeter once came to sniff Jack's work boots, and then sat down beside him as if they'd made an agreement. Jack looked down at the dog. Yours found it here. He looked at the dog for another moment. Dog's got good judgment, he said, and left it there. He left before dark, picking up his toolbox and walking back toward the tree line without ceremony. He didn't say he'd be back. He didn't say goodbye in a way that implied finality. He just left, and something in the way he did it suggested that this was how he did most things without waste of any kind. The next morning, May Denton came. She arrived in a pickup truck that had been red in a previous decade and was now the color of something that remembered being red, and she climbed out carrying a 5-gallon jug of water in each hand without apparent difficulty, which told Nora something about her before she'd said a word. You're the one who bought the water tower lot, she said. Not a question. I am. She set both jugs down at the gate, then went back to the truck and came back with a paper bag. May Denton. I own the hardware store on Main. She looked at the lot the way Jack had looked at it, with assessment and with the particular steadiness that belongs to someone who has watched things decline for a long time and is deciding what to think about someone finally doing something about it. You've been doing all of this by hand, she said. Don't have much else. May studied her for a long moment. Then she reached into the paper bag and brought out a pair of leather work gloves. She held them out. Nora looked at them. She had learned not to take things from people. Everything came with a price she couldn't see yet, or got taken back at the wrong time, or meant she owed someone something they'd collect when she couldn't pay. May saw it. She had the eyes of someone who saw most things. They're just gloves, May said. I've got a whole store full of them. Come by if you need anything else. She set the gloves on top of one of the water jugs and looked at Scout. How long has that dog been here since I got here? Maybe longer. Dogs find their way to places that need them. She said it like a statement of fact, like 2 + 2, and then she looked back at Nora with the kind of directness that belonged to a woman who had decided she didn't have time left in her life for anything other than being straight about things. That tower was standing when I opened my store, May said. My father bought his hardware there on account from the man who built the system. Honest man, from what my father said. Then something happened and he left. Nobody touched this lot since the storm took the tower down in April. She looked around the cleared perimeter, the sorted steel, the foundation emerging from the weeds. 8 months it sat. She looked back at Nora. 8 days and you've done more with it than anyone in this town bothered to attempt. She climbed back in the truck. Nora looked at the gloves. She picked them up. They were good gloves, leather palms reinforced at the fingers, the kind that lasted. She put them on. They fit. She was wearing the gloves on the 10th day when the black SUV turned off Tower Road and came through the open gate. It was clean in the way that expensive things are clean, not just washed, but detailed, the kind of clean that announces itself. The man who got out was in his late 40s, maybe 50, with gray at the temples and the build of someone who had played college sports and maintained enough of it to remain aware of it. He wore a blue dress shirt with the sleeves rolled precisely to the elbow, and he carried himself the way men carry themselves when they have decided in advance that a situation is going to resolve in their favor. He looked around the lot. He looked at the cleared perimeter, the sorted debris, the tarp shelter Nora, standing on the foundation slab with her gloved hands at her sides. He looked at Scout, who had risen from a resting position and moved without hurry to stand beside Nora, his ears level, his tail still. "You're the one who bought this parcel at the surplus auction." "I am." He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a business card, holding it out at arm's length. "Dale Mercer, Mercer Land Group." Nora didn't take the card. He held it for a moment and then set it on the nearest concrete block. "This property was slated for condemnation review," he said. "The auction listing was a procedural error. I've been in contact with the county assessor's office, and I'll be filing a formal challenge to the sale through the Board of Supervisors. The sale was legal. I signed paperwork with the county clerk. Paperwork can be reviewed." His voice was even, in practice the voice of someone who had this conversation, or conversations very much like it, with some regularity. "I'm not trying to cause you difficulty. This parcel has been part of a development plan that's been in progress for 2 years. The county should have held it for commercial rezoning, not listed it at surplus. But they listed it," Nora said, "and I bought it." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression, not quite irritation, not quite surprise, but something in between. "There's nothing here," he said. "Half an acre of concrete and weeds. No utilities, no water hookup, no septic connection. You can't build anything on this. You can't live on this." She held his gaze. "I'm already living on it." He had a response prepared, she could see it, but what she'd just said had landed somewhere slightly outside the space where his prepared responses lived. He recalibrated. It took him a second. "I'd advise you to consider a reasonable offer," he said. "These matters resolve much more easily when both parties are cooperative." She didn't say anything. He looked at Scout. Scout looked at him. "I'll be in touch," he said. He walked back to the SUV. He opened the door and he paused with one hand on the frame. "Concrete and weeds," he said. "That's all there is out here." He got in. The engine started. The SUV moved back out through the gate and turned onto Tower Road, and the dust from its tires drifted across the lot in a long, thin line and settled. Nora stood on the foundation and thought about what he had said. Concrete and weeds. She had not at any point in the conversation mentioned the foundation. She had not described the slab or the surface of the lot or what lay beneath the weeds. She had not used the word concrete. He had. He had said it like a man saying what he already knew, not like a man describing what he could see from where he was standing. He had said it with the casual confidence of someone who had thought about this lot before today, who had perhaps thought about it quite a lot, who might have reasons beyond a 2-year development plan to care what was under the weeds and the rubble and the concrete. Nora looked down at the surface of the foundation slab beneath her boots. She looked at the sorted piles of debris, at the cleared perimeter, at the emerging shape of the thing that had been built here 61 years ago, waiting under the weeds intact, solid, patient. Concrete and weeds, she thought. She looked at Scout. The dog sat beside her, ears forward, watching the empty gate where the SUV had been. "We're not going anywhere," Nora said. Scout pressed his head against her leg and stayed. Over the next week, she settled into a rhythm that was less about strategy and more about putting one thing in front of another, which was really all a rhythm ever was. Wake at first light before the town made noise in those cool, still minutes when the sky turned from black to gray and the birds in the tree line behind Jack's farmhouse began their preliminary conversations. Drink water, feed Scout from the dwindling bag of kibble, work until the morning heat peaked. She had started to know the lot the way you know a place when you've spent enough time on your hands and knees in it, not abstractly, not from a distance, but with your body in the specific way that work teaches you things that looking never does. She knew which sections of the foundation were shadowed in the morning and which got direct sun. She knew where the ground was lower on the east side, where the storm runoff had carved a shallow channel along the fence line. She knew which pieces of the collapsed steel frame could be moved by a single person with a lever and which ones would need two. She knew also that the surface of the concrete slab was not entirely uniform. She had noticed it on the sixth day, a slight differentiation in texture in the central section of the slab, an area roughly 8 feet across where the concrete surface was smoother than the surrounding sections. She had walked over it twice and felt nothing conclusive beneath her boots, and then filed the observation in the part of her mind where she put things she couldn't do anything about yet. Jack came back on the fourth day after his first visit, and then the day after that, and then with the regularity of something that had been decided without being announced. He brought tools. He showed her things. He did not stay late or arrive early or behave in any way like someone who was there because he felt sorry for her. He was there because there was a foundation that needed someone to think about it seriously, and she was the only one thinking about it. And he was a man who had spent his life taking foundations seriously. His wife, Carol, he said one afternoon, not out of nowhere, but in the natural progression of a conversation that had arrived at the subject sideways, would have been here on the first day. With sandwiches and lumber both. What kind of person was she? He was quiet for a moment. He was checking a corner measurement, and he finished checking it before he answered. The kind that didn't wait to be asked, he said. She saw something that needed doing, and she did it. Didn't announce it. Didn't make it a project. Just did it. He put the square down. The house has been wrong since she left. Too quiet. Building things helps. He said this with the flatness of a man who had already processed the statement many times and had arrived at the version of it that he could say out loud without it taking him somewhere he couldn't come back from easily. Ruth was the same way, Nora said. She taught me everything I know about fixing things. She died when I was 14. He looked at her with the steady, unperforming sympathy of someone who knows exactly what a loss like that weighs. Then you've been doing this on your own a long time, he said. Yeah. He picked up the framing square again. The work resumed. They didn't say anything else about it, and they didn't need to. May brought food twice that week. A bag of sandwiches from Rosie's Diner the first time, which she handed over without explanation and without staying. A box of canned goods the second time with a note on top that said in her handwriting, which was the handwriting of a woman who had decided a long time ago that neatness was worth the effort. Come by the store if you need anything. No tab. Nora had folded the note and put it in her jacket pocket next to the property deed. She didn't know yet what May knew. She didn't know yet what the hardware store owner remembered about this lot, or what her father had told her about the man who had built the system, or what any of that had to do with the name on the property deed Nora carried against her chest. She didn't know yet that the name Briggs meant something in this town, that it had meant something once, and had been made to mean nothing, and was now improbably at a surplus auction on a Tuesday afternoon in September, beginning to mean something again. She didn't know any of it yet. She knew that she had a half-acre of land with her name on a deed in her pocket, and a dog that had appointed itself her perimeter guard, and a retired carpenter who had shown up without being asked and taught her things. Her hands were already half ready to know. She knew that a man named Dale Mercer had stood on this concrete and said concrete and weeds in the voice of someone who had thought about this lot before today, and that there was a reason for that she hadn't found yet. And she knew in the way you know things that your body registers before your mind catches up, that the surface of the foundation slab in the central section was different from the surrounding sections. Not broken, not damaged, different. On the 17th day, Scout stopped patrolling the perimeter and started digging. He had been circling it all morning in his usual pattern, slow and methodical, keeping watch. Then in the middle of the morning, he stopped in the center of the foundation slab near a section she hadn't fully cleared yet and began to dig. Front paws working fast, throwing small pieces of grit and debris behind him, nose low to the surface, whining not a loud sound, not distressed, but constant, insistent. Scout. She walked over. Hey, stop. He looked at her and kept digging. She said his name again more firmly. He paused long enough to look at her with the expression dogs use when they are tolerating something they consider unreasonable, and then he went back to digging. She crouched beside him. She put her hand on the surface of the slab. She felt it. Not a crack, not a stress fracture from the storm or the years. A line, clean and straight and deliberate, a seam running between two sections of concrete that had been poured separately with a thin gap between them, that had been filled with something dark, tar maybe, or a rubberized sealant pressed in carefully and smoothed over. She knocked on the concrete to the right of the seam with her knuckle. Solid, dense, the sound of something all the way through. She knocked to the left. The sound was different. Not much, but enough. The difference between a wall and a door. She sat back on her heels. Her pulse had changed. She was aware of it changing the way you're aware of your heartbeat when it stops being background noise and starts being foreground information. She looked at Scout. The dog had stopped digging. He sat beside her, nose pointed at the seam, ears forward, and looked at her with the patient certainty of something that has been trying to tell you something for a while and is glad you're finally paying attention. She had been around enough construction sites, following Ruth to maintenance jobs, watching repairmen work in group home basements, studying things because there was never enough money to pay someone else to understand them, to know what a standard foundation slab looked like from the surface. Poured concrete, rebar beneath, anchor bolts at the perimeter, solid and uniform all the way through. A sealed panel in the center of a foundation that sounded hollow was not standard. It was deliberate. Someone had built this on purpose. She stood up. Scout stayed beside her, his shoulder warm against her leg. She looked at the seam for a long time. She looked at the anchor bolts on the perimeter, rusted to dark orange, but still seated solidly in the concrete. She looked at the eastern sky where a line of clouds was building above the corn stubble. She thought about Dale Mercer standing on this concrete, saying concrete and weeds before she described the slab, saying it with the ease of a man who had thought about this ground before today. She thought about the deed in her pocket, the name on it, Nora Briggs Calloway. Briggs. She had carried that name her whole life without knowing what it was attached to. It was her mother's name, Claire Briggs, who had died in a car accident in January of 2000 when Nora was 4 years old, whose face Nora could not recall with any precision, whose voice she remembered only as warmth without specific sound. She had been told in the paperwork that passed through foster care offices over the years that there was no next of kin, no family, no one to go to. She was standing on a concrete foundation in a town she'd never heard of, with a deed in her pocket bearing the last name of a mother she barely remembered, in a lot that had apparently not been used or touched since the water tower collapsed in April 5 months ago, and there was something under the ground. Something someone had put there on purpose. She needed a pry bar. She looked at Scout. First thing tomorrow, she said. Scout's tail swept the concrete once a single deliberate arc, and he walked back toward the tarp to find his spot in the afternoon shade. She stood at the seam for another minute and thought about the sound the concrete made when she knocked on the right side versus the left. She thought about what that difference meant. She thought about the name Briggs. Above the cleared lot, the September sky was wide, and the clouds were moving in from the east, and the light was the color of something that had been waiting a long time. She thought, there is something under this ground that someone sealed here deliberately. There is a name on a deed in my pocket. There is a man who knew about the concrete before he arrived. And she thought I bought this lot for $5 because I needed somewhere to sleep. She hadn't known that Tuesday afternoon at the auction that she was bidding on something that had been waiting for her specifically. She hadn't known that the lot at the end of Tower Road had a name attached to it that was also her name. She hadn't known that the foundation beneath the weeds had been built by hands that shared her blood, or that those hands had sealed something inside it 60 years ago, with the patience of someone who believed against all available evidence that the right person would eventually come. She hadn't known any of it. She had $5 and needed somewhere to sleep. Sometimes that's how it starts. She borrowed a pry bar from May's store the next morning. She walked the 2 miles into town before the hardware store opened, waited on the step with Scout beside her, and when May unlocked the door at 7 and found her there, May didn't ask questions. She looked at Nora's face and went to the back and came out with a 48-inch pry bar, a good one with a forged steel head and enough heft to mean business. "Need anything else?" May asked. "Not yet," Nora said. She carried the bar back to the lot with Scout trotting alongside, and she went straight to the seam in the center of the foundation slab without stopping for water or for the half piece of bread she'd saved from the night before. Jack's truck was already parked at the fence line when she got there. He was standing at the gate with his coffee, thermos, and his canvas hat looking at the slab. And when she arrived, he looked at the pry bar and then at her face and said nothing, which was the right thing. She showed him the seam. He crouched and ran his fingers along it the way she had, slowly feeling the edge of each section. He knocked on the right side and then the left, and the difference in sound registered in his expression, not surprise but recognition. The look of a man who has opened enough walls in his career to understand immediately what he is looking at. "That's deliberate work," he said. "I know. Whoever poured this knew what they were doing. That sealant's been in there a long time." He stood his knee clicking on the way up. "You want me to stay?" "Yes." He stepped back to give her room. She worked the flat end of the bar into the seam at the south edge of the panel, where the gap was widest, and she pushed. The old sealant cracked. It had the sound of something releasing, not breaking, but letting go, which was different. She pushed again, leaning her full weight into the bar, and the concrete panel shifted a quarter inch. There was a space underneath. She knew it before she could prove it. She knew it the way you know things that have already been true for longer than you've been paying attention. She worked the bar around the perimeter of the panel section by section, cracking the sealant loose on each side. The concrete was thick, nearly 4 inches, reinforced with rebar she could feel binding against the bar as she pried. Jack stayed quiet. Scout sat at the edge of the cleared area and watched with his ears forward, not pacing now, just watching, as if whatever was about to happen was something he had been waiting for with more patience than any of the rest of them. 2 hours. That was how long it took to work the panel loose piece by piece, leveraging each section out of its seat and setting it aside, the concrete, heavy and reluctant, the rebar screeching as it pulled free of the surrounding slab. The morning had gone from cool to warm by the time the opening was wide enough to see into properly. She looked down. A chamber, 6 feet deep, 4 feet across, lined on all 4 walls, in the floor with poured concrete that was dry and pale, and intact, not a crack anywhere, not a water stain, not a mark of any kind. Whoever had built this had waterproofed it properly, and then waited, and the concrete had done what good concrete does when it is mixed right and poured with care. It had lasted. At the bottom of the chamber, resting on the dry floor, was a wooden box. Dark walnut, the finish still visible beneath a fine coating of dust. Wrapped in oilcloth that had been tied down with twine so old it had gone brittle and had partially disintegrated along one side. The cloth was still intact. The box beneath it was intact. Scout leaned his head over the edge of the opening and let out a single low bark. Not alarm, something else. The way a dog announces the completion of a job it was given before it could remember receiving it. Nora lowered herself into the chamber. The air was different down here, dry and mineral with the smell of stone that has been sealed away from weather and wind and time for longer than she had been alive. Her boots hit the floor and she stood in the enclosed space with her head just below the level of the slab. She crouched and she lifted the box. It was heavier than it looked. She climbed back out with it and set it on the cleared surface of the slab, and she sat cross-legged in front of it And Jack stood back, and Scout came forward and pressed his nose against every inch of the oilcloth with the methodical focus of a professional. She cut the brittle twine with her pocket knife. The oilcloth fell open. The box had dovetailed corners and a hinged lid and no lock. The wood was smooth under her hands. Someone had taken time with this, not just building it to contain something, but building it the way you build something you want to survive. She lifted the lid. Inside, packed carefully organized with the attention of someone who had thought about this moment before it happened. A leather-bound journal, its cover worn dark with handling. A stack of photographs wrapped in wax paper. A bundle of papers tied with a faded blue ribbon. A sealed envelope yellowed at the edges with handwriting across the front. She picked up the envelope first. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the kind of penmanship that came from a generation that had been taught it as a serious subject, that understood a man's hand on paper said something about him whether he intended it to or not. To whoever carries the Briggs name forward. Her hand went still. Briggs, her name, her mother's name, the name on the deed in her jacket pocket, and the name on every piece of institutional paperwork she had signed or been handed, or had filled in at the top of forms in offices that smelled like carpet cleaner and fluorescent light for as long as she could remember having a name at all. She set the envelope down. She picked up the journal instead. The leather was cracked along the spine, and when she opened it, the pages were stiff but whole intact, the way things are intact when they have been sealed away from the ordinary process of decay. The first entry was dated April 12, 1955. Started work on the municipal water system today. The council voted 6-1 to approve the project. Mayor Harlan shook my hand on the courthouse steps and said, "This town has been waiting 20 years for clean water." I told him we'd have it running by fall. "My name is Walter Briggs, and I am the new water commissioner of Colton." She read it twice. The voice she had heard at the beginning of everything. The voice that had said my name is Walter Briggs, and then cut away to Route 11 in a broken-down Civic in $57, in a life that had produced neither roots nor name recognition in any town she'd ever passed through. She had imagined that voice, and now it was here on a page that had been waiting under her feet for 61 years. She turned pages carefully the way you handle something you understand is irreplaceable. Walter wrote about pipe layouts and pump capacities in the precise, undecorated language of an engineer who respected what he was doing enough not to dress it up. He wrote about the men on his crew, 4 of them, name by name, described with the spare affection of a supervisor who noticed what people were good at and let that be their introduction. He wrote about pouring the foundation of the tower in August heat, about the satisfaction of watching the concrete set and knowing it was right. He wrote about testing the first valve in the distribution line on a Wednesday morning in October 1956, and watching water move through the pipe he had designed under the pressure he had calculated into the houses of people who had been hauling water from wells and creeks for 20 years. He wrote about his wife, Ellen, who brought him lunch at the worksite every day, and who had a way of reading the crew's morale before Walter could see it himself, and adjusting accordingly, which he called a gift, and which he recognized as a kind of intelligence he did not possess. He wrote, "Claire is 3 today. Ellen made a cake with pink frosting, and Claire got it everywhere in her hair on the dog on my good shirt. I don't care about the shirt. She's the best thing I ever built." Nora stopped reading. She sat on the concrete in the September sun and looked at the name on the page until the letters lost their shape. Claire. Her mother's name. Claire Briggs, who had died in January 2000 at 47 years old in a car accident in a city Nora didn't know, leaving behind a 4-year-old who would spend the next 6 years with a woman named Ruth, and then 6 years in the foster system, and then 2 years sleeping in cars and shelters and on the ground, and who had ended up here. On the foundation, her grandfather poured reading his handwriting. She set the journal down. She picked up the photographs. The first one showed a young man in work clothes standing in front of a steel framework that she recognized immediately, even unfinished, as the skeleton of the water tower. He was tall and lean, dark-haired, grinning with the unguarded satisfaction of a man in the middle of doing the thing he was built to do. Behind him, the half-built structure reached into a clear summer sky. She looked at his jaw. She looked at the line of it. She had seen that jaw in every mirror available to her for 20 years, and she had never known where it came from until right now. Walter Briggs, her grandfather. The next photographs were family pictures. Walter and a woman with kind eyes and light hair standing on a porch she didn't recognize. Walter holding a bundled infant with the specific, careful happiness of a man not accustomed to holding small things. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, sitting on a tractor with Walter beside her, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. The girl with dark hair and a gap-toothed smile that Nora recognized because it was the same gap-toothed smile in the one photograph Ruth had kept on the dresser, the one Nora had carried in the back of her mind for 20 years, as the only visual record of her mother as a child. That was Claire, sitting on a tractor with her father laughing in a town neither of them would live in much longer. Jack said nothing. He stood back with his coffee thermos, and he let her sit with it, because he was the kind of man who understood that some things needed to happen in their own time, and that the worst thing you could do in those moments was speak. She laid the photographs on the concrete beside her and tried to breathe. Her throat was so tight that breathing required conscious effort. She had spent 20 years believing she came from nothing. That was the story she had been given in the way that institutions give you stories, not deliberately, not cruelly, but through the accumulated weight of forms that listed no family and offices, that said no next of kin, and a system that processed her as a unit without origin, because that was administratively simpler than asking what was actually true. She had a grandfather. He had lived here. He had built the thing she was sitting on. He had sealed his life into the foundation of it before he left. She spent the next 3 hours reading the journal from the point where the family entries began to shift in tone, sitting on the concrete while Jack brought her water without being asked, and Scout lay with his head on her knee. Yeah. The early years were good. Walter finished the water system in 1956 ahead of schedule. The town celebrated. The journal entries from that period had a quality of settled satisfaction, the tone of a man who has done the work he was built to do and watches it function the way it's supposed to. Then around 1959, the tone changed. A man named Gerald Mercer had arrived in the county and begun buying farmland on the east side of Colton. Gerald wanted to develop. He needed water rights. The municipal supply, the one Walter had built, was the only reliable source in the area. Gerald came to the town council with a proposal he would invest in expanding the system if the town granted him development rights to the water infrastructure. Walter opposed it. He wrote about it in language that was still careful, but carried an undercurrent of anger the way a river carries temperature you can't see but feel the moment you put your hand in. Mercer doesn't want to improve the system. He wants to own it. Once he controls the water, he controls who builds where, who pays what, and who gets left out. I told the council this at the meeting. Half of them listened. The other half were looking at the check Mercer was already holding out. The entries grew darker in the months that followed. Gerald Mercer started a campaign. Rumors about mismanaged public funds, questions about receipts and invoices that had always been in order. A letter to the county paper suggesting an audit. The audit found nothing wrong. Every dollar Walter Briggs had spent in 5 years as water commissioner was accounted for, documented, legitimate. But the damage had already been done in the space between accusation and clearance, which was the space Gerald Mercer had been counting on. In March of 1961, the council voted 4-3 to eliminate Walter's position. They didn't fire him for cause. They restructured the commission. New title, new appointment, same job given to a man Gerald Mercer had already identified. Legal, technical. And everyone in Colton who had been paying attention knew exactly what it was. They didn't have the courage to accuse me of anything real because there was nothing real to accuse me of. So they erased the position instead. I've spent 5 years building clean water for every house in this town. This is what I get for refusing to let one man own it. Walter sealed the chamber 2 weeks later. He described the process the way he described everything, precisely with the professional satisfaction of work done correctly. The concrete mix, the waterproofing, the placement, the panel construction and installation, and final sealant. If they take everything else, they can't take what's buried in the thing I built with my own hands. The last front section entry was dated 3 days before the first Missouri entry. His handwriting was controlled, but the pressure on the page was harder, as if the pen needed to be held more firmly than usual. We leave tomorrow, Ellen, Claire, and me. I'm loading what I can tonight. Ellen is sick. She won't say how bad. Claire cried tonight. She's 8 years old, and she knows we're running, but not why. I told her we'd come back someday. I don't know if that's true. I know I built this town something it needed, and it wasn't enough to make them keep me. I know the chamber will hold. I know whoever finds it will know what happened here. Nora closed the journal. She looked at Jack. He was leaning against the concrete wall section with his coffee, and he looked back at her without saying anything, waiting. My grandfather built the water tower, Nora said. His name was Walter Briggs. He was the water commissioner here from 1955 to 1961. A man named Gerald Mercer ran him out of town because he wouldn't hand over the water rights. Jack was quiet for a moment. Gerald Mercer, he said. Dale Mercer's grandfather. Jack looked at the cleared foundation, at the open chamber, at the box on the concrete between them. He looked at it for a long time. That explained some things, he said. They drove to the hardware store. May was behind the counter sorting a delivery of fasteners when they walked in, and she took one look at both of their faces and set down the box. Nora put the journal and the photographs on the counter without speaking. May leaned forward, reading the first entry over her glasses. Her expression moved through several things in sequence: recognition, then the kind of stillness that comes when something long suspected is suddenly confirmed. Walter Briggs, May said slowly. She said it the way you say a name that has lived at the edge of your memory for decades without ever quite surfacing. My father talked about him, said he was the most honest man who ever held a public office in this town. Said something happened and he left, and whatever happened wasn't right. She looked at the photograph of Walter standing in front of the unfinished tower. Briggs, she said. She looked at Nora. That's your last name. He was my grandfather. The little girl in the family photographs, that's my mother, Claire. She died when I was 4. I was raised by a woman named Ruth until I was 14. May was quiet for a long time. She looked at the photograph. She looked at Nora. She pulled her reading glasses off and set them on the counter and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose. Come with me, she said. She led them to the back room of the store, where a filing cabinet stood against the wall between shelving units full of old inventory boxes and a corkboard covered in faded papers. May pulled open the bottom drawer and riffled through it with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew where everything was, even if it didn't look that way, and she came out with a manila folder marked Town Records Miscellaneous. Inside were photocopied pages from the county archive, meeting minutes from the 1950s and 60s, property transfers, commission appointments. She spread them on the workbench. Here she said, and pointed to a page dated August 1955. Walter Briggs appointed water commissioner by unanimous vote of the Colton Town Council. She turned pages. And here, March 1961. Motion to restructure the Water Commission sponsored by council members Dawes and Patton. Gerald Mercer listed as a community stakeholder present and in support. May's voice was flat. Gerald Mercer sat on the advisory committee for 2 years before that vote. His family had been in this county since his father's time. They knew how to work a room. She looked at Nora. Dale Mercer runs the biggest land development operation in the county now. His father, then him. 3rd generation. Nora looked at the 1,961 minutes. The language was dry and parliamentary, the kind of language designed to make one thing look like another thing, to make the removal of a man look like an administrative adjustment, to make the theft of a career look like a restructuring. But underneath the language, the facts were there, and the facts were plain. Walter Briggs had been erased from the thing he had built. My grandfather didn't mismanage anything, Nora said. No, May said. He didn't. She met Nora's eyes. My father always said something was wrong about how he left. Said Walter was the kind of man who checked his work twice and didn't cut corners, and men like that don't mismanage public money. She paused. The town lost something when he left. The water system he built ran better than anything that came after it for 20 years. She folded the papers. Dale Mercer showing up at your gate makes a lot more sense now. He said the words concrete and weeds, Nora said, before I described the slab. May looked at her steadily. Meaning he's thought about that lot? Meaning someone in his family has thought about that lot for a long time. May put the folder back in the drawer and pushed it closed. She looked at the photographs still on the counter, Walter at the tower, Claire on the tractor, Ellen and Walter on the porch. You haven't opened the letter yet, Jack said. It wasn't a question. He had been watching her all morning, and he had noticed the envelope, and he understood without being told that she was saving it. Not yet, she said. He nodded. Some things needed to be understood before they could be read. They took the bundle of papers back to the lot. Nora sat on the foundation in the afternoon light with the blue ribbon bundle in her lap and untied it. Savings bonds. Series E, United States government issue. Dated between 1955 and 1961. 16 bonds in total face values ranging from $50 to $500. She spread them on the concrete and counted them twice. Jack crouched beside her, looking at the bonds without touching them. These mature over time, he said. Series E bonds keep earning interest for decades. How long? He looked at the issue dates. 30 years originally, and then the government extends them under continued maturity provisions. These are more than 60 years old. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know the exact figures, neither did she, but she knew enough to know that 60 years of compound interest on 16 bonds was a number that had no relationship to anything she had ever possessed. She looked at the bonds spread on the concrete, at the careful handwriting on each one, at the denominations that told the story of a man buying as much as his salary would allow month after month, year after year, with the discipline of someone who believed that the future was worth putting something into, even when the present was pressing hard on every side. She gathered them into the envelope with the photographs and the journal and put them in the oilcloth bundle, and she went to the bank the next morning. The bank was on Main Street, 2 doors down from May's store. Nora walked in wearing the cleanest clothes she owned and carrying the bonds in the manila envelope she had found in May's supply cabinet. The teller was a young man who looked at the bonds, looked at Nora, and excused himself with the measured urgency of someone who needed to get a manager without making it obvious that he needed to get a manager. The manager was a woman named Mrs. Alderman, somewhere in her late 50s, with reading glasses on a chain, and the composed, unhurried manner of someone who had processed many unusual things in her career and was not going to be unsettled by another one. She brought Nora to her office, closed the door, spread the bonds on her desk one by one, and began working through them with a reference table and a calculator. Series E bonds, she said, issued between 1955 and 1961, all past final maturity. She adjusted her glasses and kept working. The bonds earn interest for 30 years, and then if they're not redeemed, the interest continues under extended maturity provisions until final expiration. Nora sat with her hands clasped in her lap and watched Mrs. Alderman work through the figures. The calculation took 15 minutes. Mrs. Alderman checked her numbers twice, which Nora appreciated, and then she set down her pen and looked up. The combined matured value of these 16 bonds, she said, is $52,341. The number arrived in the room like a physical event. Nora heard it as sound before she heard it as meaning a collection of syllables that took 3 seconds to become numbers and then another 3 seconds to become something real. I'm sorry, Nora said. How much $52,341? Nora sat very still. The room did not tilt, but there was a quality to the air that was different from before. She looked at the bonds spread on the desk, the careful denominations, the dates that ran from 1955 to 1961, one per year, give or take the accumulated savings of a man who earned a water commissioner's salary in a small Illinois town in the 1950s and put as much of it as he could into the future every single month. Are you all right, Mrs. Alderman asked. Yes, Nora said. The word came out as a whisper, so she said it again with more substance behind it. Yes, I need a minute. Mrs. Alderman gave her several. They discussed the redemption process, paperwork to verify Nora's identity and her connection to Walter Briggs as his descendant. The property deed would help. The journal would help. A DNA test might eventually be required to formalize the airship, but Mrs. Alderman was cautiously optimistic that the documentary chain was strong enough to proceed. It would take 2 to 3 weeks. Nora walked out of the bank into the October sun. Jack was parked at the curb in his truck, which she had not asked him to do, and which did not surprise her in the least. She got in. She sat in the passenger seat with the envelope on her knees and stared through the windshield at the hardware store 2 doors down and said nothing. Jack waited. After a while, she told him the number. He said nothing for a moment. He looked out the windshield at the same hardware store she was looking at. Then he said he saved that bond by bond from a water commissioner's salary. Every month from 1955 until they took the job away from him in 1961. He put what he had into the ground and sealed it and walked away. Yes, he knew someone would need it someday. She pressed her forehead against the window glass and sobbed. The kind of crying that doesn't perform itself, that doesn't announce its arrival or moderate its intensity for an audience that comes from somewhere below the level where decisions are made and simply happens the way weather happens. She sobbed for the $57 she'd had in her pocket when she walked into Colton. She sobbed for the gas station sandwiches and the shelter cots and the group home Tuesdays and the birthday in a parking lot when she was 16 with no one to tell. She sobbed for Ruth, who had deserved better and gotten worse, and for Claire, who had run from something Nora now understood and had never found her way back. She sobbed most of all for a number $52,341 that represented 60 years of patient faith from a man she had never met and until 3 days ago had never known existed. Jack sat in the driver's seat and looked at the hardware store. He didn't speak. He didn't put a hand on her shoulder or tell her it was going to be okay. He simply stayed, which was exactly right, and which she understood was harder than it looked. After a while, she straightened up. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket. She looked at the envelope on her knees. "There's still the letter," she said. He started the truck. "Let's go read the rest of the journal first." She had not finished the journal. She had read the front section, the Colton years, the construction, the Mercer campaign, and had put it down to examine the photographs and the bonds. But she had noticed on that first day that the back section of the journal was not blank. 40 pages from the rear cover, starting from the back and working forward, there were more entries. Different ink. Shakier handwriting, the letters uneven and pressed with more effort than the early pages, the hand of a man writing through the physical changes that decades bring. She read these new entries on the foundation in the afternoon with Scout beside her, and Jack leaning against the concrete wall, drinking coffee and saying nothing. The first back section entry was dated November 4th, 1997. "I haven't written in this book in 34 years. Ellen is gone. She died March 9th, 1970. Cancer. I held her hand until the end. I promised her I would take care of Claire. I broke that promise." He wrote about Claire leaving a note on the kitchen table a Tuesday night in the summer of 1969. She was 17. She said she would call when she was ready. She never called. He looked for 3 years and the trail went cold in 3 different cities. By 1974, he had stopped. He was 63 years old at that point. He wrote, living in a rented room in Springfield, Missouri, working maintenance at a school district. He had lost his wife. He had lost his daughter. He had lost his town and his career. The only thing he still owned in the world was a sealed chamber under a water tower 60 miles north of where he sat, and a box inside it that held everything he had put aside for whoever came after him. The entries after that were spaced years apart. Walter wrote about his health with the unsentimental precision he applied to everything: a heart condition diagnosed in 1989 medication. He could barely afford a knee that needed replacing. The slow inventory of a body wearing out, described without self-pity and without drama, the way a good engineer writes a maintenance report on equipment past its service life. Nora read all of it. She read the entry from his 70th birthday, which he noted with a single line. She read the entry from 1993 about a neighbor named Gus who had died of a stroke and whose cats Walter had taken in because no one else would, and who were fine, he said, though one of them had opinions about the chair by the window. She read it all the way through to the entry from June 2nd, 2000, and there she stopped. "A woman from the state of Ohio called me today. A social worker named Mrs. Kessler. She said my daughter Claire died in a car accident on January 19th of this year. She was 47 years old. The handwriting on this entry was different from the surrounding ones. The pressure harder. The letter slightly larger, as if the hand needed more space to hold what it was trying to put down. Mrs. Kessler said Claire had a daughter, a little girl named Nora. She is 4 years old. Claire listed me as next of kin on a form she filled out at the hospital when the child was born. That is how they found me. The first time anyone has found me in 30 years. I asked Mrs. Kessler if I could take Nora. She said there would be an evaluation. I am 80 years old. I have a heart condition. I live in a one-room apartment in Springfield, Missouri. I do not own a car. I told her I would do whatever it took. She said she would be in touch. The next entry was 14 days later. The state denied my petition. They said I am too old and too ill to be a suitable guardian. They said Nora will be placed in the foster system where she will receive proper care. I told them I am her grandfather. They said that wasn't sufficient. Nora set the journal down on the concrete. She put her palms flat on the surface of the slab and held them there, feeling the solid warmth of it under her hands. She looked at the open chamber to her left, still open where they'd pried the panel loose that morning. She looked at the oilcloth bundle beside her with the photographs and the bonds and the sealed envelope still inside. She had spent 6 years in the Illinois foster care system, believing that no one had ever come looking for her. That was not a conclusion she had reached through bitterness or self-pity. It was simply the operational reality of the situation as it had been presented to her factually through the accumulated evidence of placement after placement after placement in which the slot-labeled family was always blank. No one had come. No one had asked for her. The system had absorbed her and processed her and eventually released her. And the story of her origin had the particular blankness of something that had never been addressed because there was nothing to address. There had been someone. He had asked for her. He had called the courthouse and driven there in person and written letters and been told in the language institutions use when they want to close a question that he was not sufficient. He was 80 years old and he had a bad heart and he had tried. She picked up the journal. She made herself keep reading. Walter had continued to call the Ohio office for a year. Mrs. Kessler gave him occasional updates, short ones, the kind that could be described as technically informative without actually telling him anything. Nora was in a group home. Nora was doing well in school. Nora had been moved to a different facility. He wrote down each update with the careful attention of a man maintaining a log he had no other way of contributing to. He had sent things. A blanket he had knitted himself, which she had never received. A photograph of Claire as an infant, which she had never received. A letter addressed to Nora that he'd written and rewritten over 3 days, and finally sent, which she had never received. The entries after 2001 were fewer and shorter. His health was declining. He wrote about it with the same flat precision he'd applied to everything else. The heart condition progressing, the knee finally replaced in a procedure that left him walking differently. A winter in 2003, when he hadn't left the apartment for 3 weeks and had thought with no particular alarm that he might not make it to spring. He had made it to spring. He noted this also. Then the last entry in the back section dated September 3rd, 2004. I am going back to Colton. I know the tower is probably gone or falling. 8 years is a long time, and it wasn't new when I left it. I know the town doesn't remember me. I know Gerald Mercer's family has been there all along doing what they do, and my name is nothing to anyone left in that courthouse. But the box is still there. I built that chamber to last 100 years. Inside it is everything I have left to give. I wrote a letter. I am going to add it to the box and seal it again. Whoever finds it, whether it is Nora if she ever comes looking, or someone else who carries the name, they will know what happened here. They will know I tried. I am leaving tomorrow morning. It is 9 hours from Springfield. My heart isn't good, but I have enough medication to get there and back. I just need to open the foundation, put the letter in, and seal it. If I can do that, then at least something of me survives in the place where I did my best work. I built this tower to give water to a town that needed it. I'm going back to make sure it still gives something to whoever comes next. That was the last thing Walter Briggs ever wrote. Nora closed the journal. She sat on the concrete in the October afternoon and held it against her chest for a moment, and the wind moved through the weeds along the fence line, and Scout pressed into her side, and Jack set down his coffee thermos and walked forward and put a hand on her shoulder and left it there. She needed to know. She knew from the entry that Walter had planned to drive to Colton on September 4th, 2004. She knew from the sealed envelope, which he had apparently managed to add to the box, that he had made it here, or at least made it close enough. She knew from the box itself intact and resealed that the letter had been placed inside, but she needed to know what happened on the other side of that. The next morning, May drove her to the county library. The library kept microfilm archives of the local paper going back to the 1940s. A librarian with bifocals and a quiet efficiency that Nora found deeply reassuring set her up at the reader, and she and May worked through the October 2004 issues of the Colton Register. In silence, May turning the advanced dial, Nora watching the pages scroll. They found it on October 8, 2004 in the local section. 4 paragraphs. The kind of article that got written because someone had to write it, not because anyone expected anyone to read it. An unidentified man was found deceased in his vehicle on Route 11, approximately 40 miles west of Colton, on the afternoon of October 7th. The county coroner determined the cause of death to be cardiac arrest. The vehicle, a 1991 Ford pickup truck registered to a Walter R. Briggs of Springfield, Missouri, contained personal effects and road maps. No next of kin has been located. The remains were processed by the county medical examiner's office. Nora stopped reading. She looked at the screen. 40 miles. He had driven 9 hours from Springfield, and he had been 40 miles from this courthouse when his heart stopped. 40 miles from the tower he had built. 40 miles from the chamber he had just sealed. He had made it here first. He had made it all the way here and opened the foundation and placed the letter and sealed it again, and then driven back out on Route 11, heading toward whatever came next. And he had gotten 40 miles before the heart that had been carrying all of this for 84 years finally put down its work. May put her hand on Nora's shoulder, the same steady pressure. He made it far enough, May said quietly. He sealed the letter. He left you everything he had. He made it far enough for that. Nora didn't cry this time. She looked at the screen and at the 4 paragraphs that were all that existed in the public record of the last day of Walter Briggs's life. And she felt something that didn't have a clean name. Not grief exactly, not anger exactly, but something that combined both and ran deeper than either a feeling like standing at the edge of something enormous and understanding for the first time the full extent of its size. He had put everything he had into the ground. He had sealed it and left it, and spent 40 years trying to give her what the ground was holding, and he had died 40 miles from it on the road home. He had done everything a man with a failing heart and a lifetime of waiting could do, and it had been enough to get the letter into her hands. She thanked the librarian. She walked out with May into the October air. That afternoon, the letter from Dale Mercer's lawyer arrived. May brought it to the lot herself, holding it at a careful distance. The way you carry something that you want the recipient to understand is not your doing. Certified mail, she said, came to my store. Your name on it. I signed for it. Nora opened it, standing in the afternoon light with Scout at her feet. The language was dense and formal, the kind of language that had been designed over many professional years to sound reasonable while saying something that wasn't. The substance was this: Mercer Land Group was formally challenging the auction sale of Lot 14 on grounds that the parcel had been improperly classified as surplus, given its designation in the 2022 County Master Plan as a commercial overlay zone. A hearing would be scheduled before the County Board of Supervisors. In the meantime, the letter advised Nora should refrain from any construction or further modification of the property. Can they do this? She asked. They can file whatever they want, May said. Doesn't mean they'll win. She looked at the letter, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone who has been watching one family throw its weight around in a town for 3 generations and has been waiting with the patience of someone who runs a hardware store and therefore understands the long timelines of durable things for the moment when that weight finally meets something it can't move. Come on, she said. Let's go talk to someone who actually knows what this means. They drove to the county clerk's office. The same woman who had processed Nora's paperwork at the auction, Mrs. Delano, who had the reading glasses on a chain and the brisk, informed efficiency of someone who knew every document in her office and its implications, pulled the file and spread it on the counter. She ran her finger down each page with the focused attention of someone who takes procedural correctness seriously. The listing was proper, she said. The parcel was declared surplus by the county assessor 18 months ago. It went through the standard 90-day review period. No objections were filed during that window. She tapped the signature line. This sale is legally clean. So his challenge has no basis, May said. Mrs. Delano looked at her over her glasses. I didn't say that. He can still argue to the board that the assessor made an error or that the commercial overlay created an obligation to hold the parcel rather than surplus it. The board can hear that argument. But as of today, this sale is valid. She looked at Nora. The property is yours. Nora let out a breath that had been in her chest since the certified envelope arrived. Thank you, she said. Mrs. Delano closed the file. For what it's worth, she said, I grew up in this town. My father always said the man who built the water system was the most honest person he'd ever done business with. She looked at Nora for a moment. Good luck. The hearing was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks in which Dale Mercer apparently decided to make his intentions clearer. He sent a second letter through his lawyer 6 days after the first, this one more specific about the airship question. The bonds, the letter argued, could not be claimed without legal proof of direct descent from Walter Briggs, and Nora's documentation was insufficient to establish that proof. The letter recommended she consult an attorney. The letter recommended between its lines that the most practical resolution was to cease her claim on both the property and the bonds and accept a settlement offer that the letter vaguely implied might be forthcoming. And on the 9th day after the first letter, a man Nora didn't recognize was at the library when she went to request copies of the microfilm records. He sat at a reader nearby and did not look at her directly, but he was there when she arrived and still there when she left. And she mentioned it to Jack that evening, and Jack was quiet for a moment. Mercer's keeping track of what you know, he said. I know. He looked at the half-built frame of the wall section they'd been working on that afternoon, the skeleton of something that was still mostly imaginary, but was starting to have the weight and dimension of something real. 3 weeks, Jack said. 3 weeks. He picked up a nail and set it against the top plate with his thumb and drove it home in 2 strokes, clean and flush, the way a man drives a nail when he has been doing it long enough that it is simply an extension of what his hands know. Then let's make sure you've got something to show them when you walk in there, he said. She opened the letter on the 9th evening after it arrived, when the temperature had dropped enough that she could see her breath inside the half-built structure, and the wood stove Jack had installed 2 days earlier was earning its place against the north wall. She had been saving it. She had known from the moment she read the address on the envelope that this was the last thing, the final piece of what Walter had assembled in that chamber and sealed there with the patient faith of someone who did not know when it would be found, or by whom only that it needed to be ready when it was. She had needed to understand everything else first: the journal, the photographs, the bonds, the microfilm at the library, and the 4 paragraphs that accounted for the last day of his life. She had needed to hold all of it in her hands before she could hold this. Scout lay on the blanket beside the stove. The fire made small sounds. Outside, the October wind moved through the weeds along the fence line with a low, continuous voice. She broke the seal and unfolded 2 pages of the same handwriting she had come to know over the past weeks. The later handwriting uneven and pressed hard into the page, the hand of a man writing through the resistance of a body that had been carrying too much for too long. To whoever carries the Briggs name forward. If you are reading this, you found your way here. You found the tower, or what is left of it. You found the chamber I built into the foundation when I was 41 years old, and still believed I could outsmart the people who wanted to take what I had built. My name is Walter Briggs. I was the water commissioner of Colton, Illinois, from 1955 to 1961. I built this tower with my own hands and a crew of 4 good men, and I poured every section of this foundation myself and tested every valve in the system before I signed off on it. It was the best work I ever did for this town. The second best thing I ever did was raise my daughter Claire in it. I lost both. The tower was taken from me by politics and by one man's greed and by a town council that chose the easier thing when the harder thing was right in front of them. Claire was taken from me by my own stubbornness and by the bad luck that follows people who make one wrong choice at the wrong time and spend the rest of their lives living inside the consequences. I do not know who you are. Maybe you are Nora, my granddaughter. A social worker named Mrs. Kessler told me about you in the summer of 2000. 4 years old when I found out you existed. The state said I was too old to care for you. Maybe they were right about that. But I want you to know that I tried. I drove to Jefferson City twice. I wrote 6 letters. I called every week for a year. They would not let me see you. If you are not Nora, that is all right too. Whoever you are, you found this place. You cared enough to look. That is enough. The bonds are yours. The land is yours. The photographs and the journal are yours. Everything I had left to give is in this box. I built this tower to give water to a town that needed it. I built this chamber to give a future to whoever came next. I did not know when I sealed it in 1961 that it would be 60 years before anyone opened it. I did not plan for 60 years. I planned for however long it took. If you are reading this, you found your way home. Build something. Stay. Walter Briggs. September 2004. She folded the letter and held it against her chest with both hands. The stove made its small sounds. Scout shifted on his blanket and pressed closer against her leg without waking. Through the open framework of the unfinished wall, she could see the October stars beginning to appear above the cleared lot. The same stars she had seen her first night here, when she had nothing but a tarp and a duffel bag and a dog she had just met. He had made it here. He had driven 9 hours from Springfield with a failing heart and a box of things he had been carrying for 40 years, and he had opened this foundation with his own hands, and he had placed this letter inside, and he had sealed it again with the same care he had applied to every piece of work in his life. And then he had gotten in his truck and driven back out on Route 11, and he had gotten 40 miles. She sat with the letter for a long time without moving, and Scout slept beside her, and the fire burned down slowly, and somewhere in that stillness, she understood something she had been carrying, without knowing it for her entire life. The belief assembled from years of institutional paperwork and empty family fields on intake forms that she had come from nothing. That she was a person without origin, without the gravitational weight of people who had come before her and built things and left marks. She had never consciously articulated this belief, but she had lived inside it the way you live inside the air without noticing it until it changes. It was not true. She had come from a man who built a water system for a whole town and sealed his savings into the foundation of it rather than let the wrong people take it. She had come from a woman who had run from pain and still written a name on a hospital form that led 20 years later back to this concrete. She had come from a grandmother who had braided her hair every morning and made oatmeal and taught her to thread a needle and fix a wall and use her hands when everything else failed. She had not come from nothing. She had come from people who built things and held on to things and put things into the ground for the people who came after them. She unfolded the letter one more time and read it again slowly. Then she folded it along its original creases and placed it back in the oilcloth bundle beside the journal in the photographs. Then she fed the stove another piece of scrap lumber and lay down on her cot with Scout against her side and slept better than she had in 2 years. May stood up at the regular town council meeting on the third Tuesday of October. Nora wasn't there. She heard about it afterward from 3 separate people, each of whom told it with a slightly different emphasis that comes from personal witness, but all of whom arrived at the same essential facts. May had walked to the public comment microphone during the open session, which was attended by perhaps 40 people, including Dale Mercer, who was sitting in the third row in a sport coat present because the upcoming Board of Supervisors hearing made it politically sensible to be visible in civic settings. May had looked at him for a moment before she spoke. Then she had said Walter Briggs built this town's water system. Every faucet in Colton runs because of him. He was driven out of this town in 1961 by Gerald Mercer, your grandfather, because he refused to hand over the water rights he had been appointed to protect. Now you are trying to take the last piece of ground that family has left. She had paused. This town has owed the Briggs family an apology for 55 years. The least we can do is let his granddaughter keep the land she bought. The room had been quiet for 10 seconds after she sat down. Dale had not responded. His expression had not changed in any visible way, but the woman sitting next to the person who told Nora this story said he had gripped his knee under the table. 2 days after the council meeting, Dale Mercer came to the lot alone. No lawyer, no SUV. He drove a pickup truck, dark blue, the kind of truck that did not announce itself, and he wore jeans and work boots and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. He stood at the gate and waited, which was different from how he had stood the first time. The first time he had walked in without pausing. This time he waited at the gate until she came to him. "I'll make you an offer," he said. His voice had changed. The practiced evenness was still there, but the edge beneath it, the particular edge of a man accustomed to these conversations going his way, was quieter. $25,000 for the half-acre cash clean title transfer. You walk away with that, plus whatever you have coming from the bonds. That is a real start, a genuine one. Nora looked at him. She thought about what $25,000 added to $52,000 would mean in practical terms. She thought about the bone-deep familiarity of cold ground and gas station food and the specific exhaustion of not knowing where you would be in 3 months. She thought about warm apartments in cities where no one knew her name, and she could start something that had nothing to do with any of this. "No," she said. Dale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're turning down $25,000. "I am." He looked at the lot behind her, at the cleared perimeter and the sorted steel and the half-frame wall section and the concrete slab and Scout standing in the doorway of the unfinished structure, watching him with the steady attention of an animal that has already made its assessment. Why, he said, not aggressive, genuinely asking. Nora looked at the lot. She looked at the foundation her grandfather had poured when he was 41 years old and still believed he could outlast the people who wanted to take his work. She looked at the wall frame Jack had helped her raise from the concrete that Walter had laid. "Because my grandfather built this," she said, "and your grandfather took it from him. And I'm not going to let that happen twice." Something moved behind Dale's eyes. She couldn't read it precisely. It was too layered for that, too many things at once. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he turned and walked back to his truck, and he drove away without another word, and the dust from his tires settled over the lot in the thin October light. The hearing was scheduled for the first Tuesday in November. In the 11 days between Dale's visit and the hearing, Nora kept building. She and Jack framed the last wall of the small structure, working in the particular silence of two people who had gotten past the stage of needing to fill the air between tasks. He had brought better lumber the second week, straighter, drier from a yard 2 towns over, where he had an account, and the difference in the work was immediate and satisfying, the kind of satisfaction that comes from using the right material for the right job. His old partner, a man he'd built houses with for 20 years before they both retired, used to say there was no economy in bad lumber. You pay twice, once at the yard and once when you fix it. Ruth used to say the same thing about thread, Nora said. Cheap thread breaks. You spend twice as long repairing what you sewed. Jack considered this. Same principle, just different materials. They worked. The structure began to have the density of something real. Something that took up space in a way that a frame didn't, that cast a shadow and blocked the wind and changed the quality of the air inside it. She had been reading Walter's journal again in the evening, slowly going back through the Colton entries with the attention of someone who now understood the context well enough to hear what was underneath the language. She had found in an entry from 1960, the year before, he was removed, a passage she had read before without fully registering. "I've been thinking about what happens to the system after I'm gone. Not gone, just moved on, eventually retired or transferred or whatever comes next. I've been thinking about whether what I built can last beyond the person who built it. A water system is only as good as the maintenance. The maintenance is only as good as the people doing it. The people only do it right if they understand what they're maintaining and why it matters. I think the answer is you have to teach people. Not just how to turn the valves, but why the valves are where they are. Why the pressure is set the way it is. What happens downstream when you change something upstream. You have to give people the understanding, not just the instructions. Otherwise, when you leave the system, degrades. She had closed the journal and sat with that passage for a long time. A water system is only as good as the maintenance. The maintenance is only as good as the people doing it. She looked at the cleared foundation, at the half-finished structure, at the open space of the lot that extended beyond it. She had been thinking about what to do with the rest of the half-acre. She had money coming if the hearing went the right way, and if Mrs. Alderman's optimism about the bond redemption proved well-founded, she would have more resources than she had ever had in her life. She could build a real house on the north end of the slab. She could do more than that. Walter had built the system to give the town something it needed. He had written about that repeatedly in the early journal entries, not in grandiose terms, but in the matter-of-fact way of someone for whom public service was simply the correct application of his skills. Clean water for every house. That was the job. He had done the job. She thought about what Colton needed now. She thought about what she knew how to do. She thought about Jack's retired hands and the tools he kept building birdhouses with because there was nothing else to put them toward. She thought about the teenagers she'd seen in town with nothing to occupy their hands, about the men who came to buy hardware and stood in May's store longer than they needed to, not because they wanted more nails, but because they wanted somewhere to stand for a while. She thought about what it meant to have a place where you could come and learn to make something real, where the knowledge passed from one pair of hands to another, the way Ruth had taught her, not from a manual, but from standing beside someone and watching and doing until your hands understood. By the evening before the hearing, she knew what she wanted to build. The County Board of Supervisors met in the courthouse meeting room, the same building where the surplus auction had been held 6 weeks earlier, though the room itself was smaller and more formal, with a long table at the front and rows of chairs facing it. Nora arrived early. She wore the cleanest clothes she owned and carried a manila folder containing copies of the journal's first entry. The photographs, the bond documentation, the property deed, and the 1961 council minutes from May's archives. Dale sat on the other side of the room with his lawyer, a man in a gray suit who carried a leather briefcase with the air of someone who considered a leather briefcase an argument in itself. Dale wore a sport coat and no tie. He did not look at her when she came in. Jack was in the fourth row on her side. May was beside him. Dave, the plumber who had run the water line to the property the previous week as a community service project with his son's scout troop. His words delivered with a straight face that did not entirely conceal the fact that he had done it because he wanted to, was in the fifth row. Hank from the lumberyard was in the back. The woman from the church who had brought food 3 times and had never once asked for Nora's name in return was near the window. Nora had not asked any of them to come. She had not organized this. They had simply appeared in the way that things appear in small towns when a situation has been developing long enough for people to decide where they stand. The 5 board members filed in and took their seats. The chairwoman was a woman named Dr. Patricia Weston, late 50s, with the brisk, fair manner of someone who had run enough meetings to know that the fastest way through one was to be precise. She called the session to order and read the formal complaint in the dry language of procedural documents. Dale's lawyer spoke first. He was smooth and organized, and he made 15 minutes of carefully structured argument sound like common sense. The 2022 Master Plan Commercial Overlay, the assessor's classification procedure, the statutory obligations of surplus listing. He used the word aspirational about the overlay in a tone that suggested aspiration was a reasonable basis for superseding a completed legal transaction. He cited 3 county code provisions. He closed by suggesting that the appropriate resolution was to reverse the sale and compensate the current holder, which sounded generous until you understood that the compensation being implied was considerably less than the bonds in the oilcloth bundle back at the lot. Then it was Nora's turn. She stood up and walked to the front of the room and stood behind the small lectern without gripping it, though her hands wanted to. She had never spoken in front of a group before. The room had the quality of a space where people are deciding something, and she was aware of every face in it. "My name is Nora Briggs Calloway," she said. "I am 20 years old. I bought lot 14 at the county surplus auction 6 weeks ago for $5 because I was homeless and I needed somewhere to sleep." The room was quiet. "After I bought it, I found a sealed chamber in the foundation of the water tower. Inside was a journal written by my grandfather, Walter Briggs, who built that tower and designed the water system that supplies this town. He was the water commissioner of Colton from 1955 to 1961. He was removed from that position through a campaign organized by Gerald Mercer, who wanted control of the water rights Walter had been appointed to protect." She opened the folder and held up the photograph, Walter standing in front of the half-built tower, young and lean and grinning in the clear summer light of 1955. "This is him. He sealed his journal, his family photographs, and his life savings into the foundation of the tower before he left, because it was the only thing they couldn't take from him. He spent 40 years trying to come back. He drove 9 hours from Springfield, Missouri in September of 2004 to add a letter to the box before he sealed it for the last time. He died of cardiac arrest on Route 11, 40 miles from this courthouse on the way home." She set the photograph down. "He left a letter to whoever found the chamber. He said, 'Build something. Stay.'" She stepped back from the lectern. "That is what I am doing. I am not a developer. I do not have a master plan or a lawyer with a briefcase or a commercial overlay map. I have a cleared foundation, a half-built house, and a grandfather who wanted someone to care about this piece of land as much as he did." She looked at the board members. "That is all I have to say." Dr. Weston asked if anyone else wished to address the board. Jack stood up from the fourth row. "I'm Jack Pruitt," he said. "I've been a carpenter in this county for 43 years. I've been helping Nora build on that property for the past month. She works harder than anyone I've worked beside in 4 decades of the trade. She's building something real, and she's building it right." He paused. "This town needs more of that, not less." He sat down. May stood. "My father knew Walter Briggs," she said. "He said Walter was the most honest man he had ever done business with in 40 years of running a store in this town. His granddaughter is the same. I watched her clear that lot by hand for a week before I even introduced myself. She didn't quit. She didn't ask for anything. She just worked." She looked at the board and then at Dale directly. "This town has owed the Briggs family something for 55 years. The least we can do is let her keep the land." She sat down. Dave stood up and said his piece. Hank from the lumberyard stood up and said his. The woman from the church stood and spoke about the kind of person who moves into a town with nothing and starts building immediately, and what that meant about character, and what character meant about the kind of neighbor a person would be. 2 more people Nora didn't know by name stood up, and each one said something different that arrived at the same place. The board deliberated for 12 minutes. Dr. Weston returned to the microphone. "The board has reviewed the complaint filed by Mercer Land Group regarding the surplus auction of Lot 14, she said. "We find that the sale was conducted in accordance with county procedures and that the commercial overlay designation in the 2022 master plan did not create a binding obligation to withhold the parcel from surplus classification. The procedural record is clean. The complaint is denied. The sale stands." She looked at Nora. "The property is yours, Miss Calloway. Congratulations." Nora thanked the board and walked out of the courthouse on legs that felt slightly disconnected from the rest of her body, the way legs feel after an hour of very still tension releases all at once. May was on the steps. Jack was beside her. Scout, who had been tied to the bench outside with a length of rope, Jack had brought for exactly this purpose, pulled at the rope and barked once when he saw her, a single declarative sound like a period. "Well," May said. "It's mine," Nora said. May hugged her. It was brief and firm and carried exactly the right amount of everything. Jack shook her hand. The grip was the grip of a man who meant it. Then he said, "Let's get back to work," and that was exactly right too. They drove back to the lot. Nora spent the rest of that afternoon framing the last section of the south wall with Jack working in the particular silence that follows a thing that has been decided. The sun came through the open framework and made long rectangles of light on the foundation slab, and Scout lay in the warmest one and watched them work, and somewhere in the middle of it, Nora understood that she was happy. Not relieved, not safe exactly, not comfortable in any conventional sense. She was sleeping on a cot in a half-finished structure in October and the waterline had only been connected 4 days ago, but happy in the specific way that comes from being exactly where you are supposed to be and doing exactly what you are supposed to be doing. The next morning, she woke to the sound of a truck engine. She pulled on her boots and stepped outside into the cold morning air and saw a flatbed delivery truck parked at the gate with its hazards blinking. Two men were unloading stacks of good lumber straight and dry, the kind that had been properly stored and was going to do what you asked it to do without argument. 24 sheets of plywood, a pallet of roofing materials, framing studs in a quantity that suggested something larger than what she planned for the house alone. "Who sent this?" she called out. The driver looked at his clipboard. Delivery order paid in full, no name on the account. He handed her the receipt. It was itemized precisely enough material to finish the house, and then some left over enough to begin framing a second larger structure on the south end of the lot. He climbed back into the cab and the truck pulled out through the gate and turned onto Tower Road, and she caught the logo on the tailgate as it turned. Mercer Land Group. She stood at the gate with the receipt in her hand and looked at the lumber stacked neatly along the fence line and said nothing for a long time. Jack arrived an hour later and looked at the lumber and looked at her and said, "Where did this come from?" She showed him the receipt. He looked at the logo on it. He looked at the lumber. He looked at her face. "You're not going to say anything," he said. She thought about it for a moment. She thought about Dale standing at this gate in jeans and work boots, the practiced edge gone from his voice. She thought about Gerald Mercer, who had stood in a town council meeting in 1961 and said the right words in the right order, and taken a man's life's work from him because he had the connections to do it and no one with the courage to stop him. 60 years is a long time to carry something wrong, she said. He put it down the only way he knew how. Jack looked at the lumber again. After a moment, he said, "Carol would have liked you." Nora looked at him. Ruth would have liked Carol. They stood there for a moment in the November morning with the lumber stacked along the fence and the half-finished house behind them and the cleared foundation stretching out under the cold sky. Then Jack picked up his tape measure and said, "We're going to need more nails," and they went to work. The house took the rest of November and the first week of December to finish. It was small, 12 by 20 feet, one room with a sleeping loft framed above the kitchen area, a wood stove against the north wall, a bathroom Jack plumbed over a long Saturday that left him walking carefully for 3 days and refusing to discuss it. The walls were insulated and drywalled. The roof did not leak. The floor was plywood that Nora planned eventually to cover with something warmer, but for now it was flat and solid, and hers, every board cut by her own hands, every nail driven by her own arm. Every time she set her palm against the doorframe, she felt the grain of the wood she had cut and sanded and fitted herself. She felt the weight of each nail she had driven flush on the first swing. She felt the particular quality of a thing built right, not perfect. There were places she would do differently if she did it again, but right the way a thing is, right when it has been made with care by someone who understood what they were doing and why it mattered. Scout slept on a bed beside the stove, which he had established as his territory on the first night, and defended without aggression by the simple expedient of being on it whenever anyone else might conceivably want to be. The workshop was a winter project. She had thought about Walter's entry from 1960, the one about maintenance and teaching, and giving people the understanding, not just the instructions. And she had walked the lot and looked at the remaining foundation slab, and at the steel from the collapsed tower that she had sorted and stacked along the fence line, over 6 weeks of clearing, and she had seen what it could become. She built it with Jack through December and into January, working in the cold with their breath visible, and the wood stove in the house running to keep the pipes from freezing. The workshop sat where the water tower had stood on the original foundation slab, the floor Walter had poured in the summer of 1955. They used the reclaimed steel from the tower's wreckage for the structural frame, the same steel Walter had welded with his own hands 60 years ago, bent and weathered, but sound, cleaned up and repositioned and doing new work. The roof was corrugated metal. The sides were open on three faces with roll-down canvas panels for weather. A long workbench ran the full length of the south wall, and tools hung from a pegboard that May donated from her store's backroom inventory with a note that said, "These have been sitting in a box for 6 years, put them to use." It wasn't fancy. It was built for working. The way useful things are built, designed around what needed to happen inside it rather than around how it looked from the outside. The floor was Walter's concrete, 60 years old, still solid, still level. Jack stood in it the first morning it was finished and walked the length of the workbench and checked it for level with the measure he'd been using for 40 years. And when the bubble settled in the center, he made a small sound of satisfaction that Nora recognized as the highest form of praise he typically offered. "Good floor," he said. "Solid pour." 60 years old, she said. He knocked on the concrete with his knuckle and listened to the sound of it. "Still talks, right," he said. He set up his Saturday class in the first week of February. Two people the first week, a man named Russell from the north end of town who wanted to build a raised garden bed and had never used a table saw, and a teenager named Marcus who came with his father and spent the whole session watching Jack's hands more than the wood, which Jack noticed and took as the right sign. The next week there were 5. The week after that, 8. By April, the class had 11 regular attendees, a father and his teenage son working on a bookshelf, 2 women from May's church learning to use a router for a project they described vaguely but pursued with focused intensity, a man Nora knew only as Ruiz, who was restoring an antique rocking chair he'd found at an estate sale, and whose questions about joinery occasionally made Jack pause and reconsider his answer, which was the mark of someone who had come in knowing more than they let on. The coffee maker appeared on the workbench in late February. Jack brought it from his house one morning without explanation and installed it between the belt sander and the jar of 16-penny nails, and it became immediately understood by everyone who used the workshop that this was where it lived and always would. May came by most evenings. She had developed a habit of bringing food that she characterized as leftovers or surplus from the diner, or items about to expire in quantities and varieties that made clear these were freshly made and carefully chosen. She would set whatever she'd brought on the kitchen counter and find a reason to stay for an hour. And she and Nora would sit at the small table Nora had built from reclaimed lumber and talk about the hardware store and the town and what Walter had written in the journal, and what it meant to be in a place long enough to have a stake in what happened to it. Jack came for dinner on Sundays. He sat at the table with Scout under his feet and ate May's cooking and argued with her about it in the comfortable way of two people who had decided they liked each other and were going to express that through disagreement about practical matters. "You burned it again," he said one Sunday in March. "I didn't burn it. I caramelized it." "There's a difference." "There's not that much difference." "There is absolutely a difference, and if you'd been paying attention for the last 20 years, you'd know that." Scout shifted under the table and put his head on Jack's boot, and Jack reached down without looking and scratched him behind the ear, and Nora set the plates down and sat across from both of them and felt the specific warmth of a room where people expect you to be there and would notice your absence. She had not had that since Ruth's kitchen table, watching her grandmother sew buttons onto a coat and hum a song with no name. She had been 14 years old, and she had not understood yet what she was about to lose. She understood it now. She understood it from the other side, from having lost it, and found it again in a different form, in a different kitchen, with different people who had arrived by routes just as improbable as her own. She had been working at May's hardware store since January, 4 days a week, 7 to 2, stocking and helping customers and doing the kind of inventory work that rewarded patience and attention to detail. May paid her $10 an hour and provided lunch every day without exception, always claiming it was leftovers, always producing something that bore no resemblance to leftovers. "You don't have to do this," Nora said once. "I know," May said, and went back to making the sandwich. In the fall, she was starting online courses through the State University Extension Program. Structural engineering. She had chosen it because of Walter, because she had read his entries about pipe layouts and load calculations and pressure systems with the recognition of someone finding words for things her hands already knew. The satisfaction he described in designing something that gave a whole town what it needed was the same satisfaction she felt when she drove a nail flush on the first swing or framed a corner square within a 32nd of an inch. She was going to learn how to do what he had done. She was going to learn it properly with the math and the theory behind what her hands already understood by instinct, so that whatever she built next would be built with the full weight of everything she knew. She was 20 years old. She had a house she had built with her own hands on land her grandfather had loved in a town that was slowly and perfectly beginning to understand what it owed to the name Briggs. She had a job and a dog and a retired carpenter who showed up on Sundays and an older woman who brought her food and called it leftovers. She had the workshop where Walter's concrete formed the floor and Walter's steel held up the roof, and where on any given Saturday, 11 people were learning to make things they didn't know they needed to make until they started. She had come from $5 in a broken-down car on Route 11. She had not come from nothing. On a Tuesday in late April, she was at the workshop sharpening a set of bench chisels when she heard footsteps on the gravel outside the gate. She looked up. A girl was standing at the open gate. 17, maybe thin, the way that people are thin when the thinness is not chosen with a garbage bag of clothes in one hand, in a posture that Nora recognized immediately and completely, the way you recognize something you've seen from the inside. The posture of someone who has learned that new places are usually worse than the last one and is assessing this one carefully before committing to entering it. She wore a hoodie that was too large by two sizes and sneakers with the soles coming away from the uppers on the left foot. Her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested not vanity, but practicality. Keep it out of the way, keep it managed. Don't let anything slow you down. "Can I help you?" Nora said. The girl looked at the workshop, at the house, at Scout who had raised his head to look at her, at the tools on the pegboard and the coffee maker between the belt sander and the nails. "I saw the sign on the highway," she said. "Community workshop, free tools and classes." Nora had put the sign up 2 weeks earlier, hand-lettered on a piece of scrap plywood staked at the shoulder of Route 11, where the turnoff for Tower Road began. May had said it looked like a child had made it. Nora had said, "Good children need workshops too." "That's us," Nora said. "Come in. Come." The girl hesitated for exactly the length of time that Nora had expected her to hesitate. Then she walked through the gate with the garbage bag bumping against her leg. Scout lifted his head all the way, assessed her for 3 full seconds, and put it back down. That was as close to an endorsement as Scout offered strangers, and Nora noted it. "I'm Nora. Delia. You hungry, Delia?" A slight pause. The pause of someone who has learned that admitting need costs something. "Yeah." Nora set down the chisel and washed her hands at the utility sink Jack had installed in February. She made 2 sandwiches from the bread and the ham in the small refrigerator May had brought over last month, claiming she had an extra one, which she did not, and she poured 2 cups of coffee from Jack's machine, and she brought them to the workbench and sat down. She didn't ask questions. She had learned from the inside of that experience that the worst thing someone could do when you were scared and hungry and had been carrying a garbage bag through April, trying to find something that wasn't worse than the last thing, was interrogate you before you'd eaten. So she talked about the workshop instead, what they made there, who came, how Jack had managed to glue his left hand to a sawhorse last month using the wrong adhesive and had required acetone and a certain amount of dignified silence to resolve. Delia laughed at that. A real laugh, short but genuine, the kind that comes out before a person remembers they're being careful. She ate fast and then slowed down. Nora recognized that too, the way the urgency eased once enough food had arrived, that the body believed it was real. After lunch, Nora showed her the bench chisels, showed her how to set the angle on the sharpening stone, how to feel the edge with your thumb without cutting yourself, how to move through the grits in sequence, and why the sequence mattered. Delia picked it up in 4 passes. Her hands moved with the instinctive feel of someone who had learned by watching someone else work, had absorbed the motion before she absorbed the explanation. "You've done this before," Nora said. "My foster dad in the last placement had a shop in his garage," Delia said, not looking up from the stone. "He taught me some things." "Why'd you leave?" Delia's hands kept moving steady and focused. "Budget cuts. The home closed. I got transferred twice and then I aged out 3 weeks ago." "Where have you been sleeping?" "Bus station in Greenfield. Then a church basement for a week. Then I started walking." Nora watched her work the chisel along the stone. Steady hands, even pressure. The kind of focus that came from having learned that being good at something was one of the few reliable forms of security available. "I have a spare room," Nora said. Delia's hands stopped. "It's small. A bed and a dresser. The stove heats the whole house and there's hot water." Delia looked at her with the careful, evaluating attention of someone who has been offered things before and knows that offers have histories. "You don't know me. I know you walked here with a garbage bag. I know you're hungry. I know you can sharpen a chisel better than half the people who come to this workshop." Nora met her eyes. "I was where you are 2 years ago, sleeping in a car, eating whatever I could afford from a gas station. No plan, no family, no address. Someone let me stay when I needed it. I'm doing the same thing." Delia looked at the workshop, at the house, at Scout, who had moved from the workbench to the floor and was lying in the afternoon light with his chin on his front paws, breathing slowly, entirely at ease. "For how long?" she said. "For as long as you need. What if I mess something up? Then we'll fix it. That's what the workshop is for." Delia moved in that afternoon. Nora gave her the spare room, a set of clean sheets and a towel. She showed her where the food was and told her the bathroom was hers whenever she needed it. She did not set rules or conditions or give a speech. She showed Delia where things were and then left her to settle at her own pace. That evening, she heard the shower running for 45 minutes. She didn't say anything about it. She knew exactly what that felt like, to stand under hot water after months without it and feel the warmth go all the way down into the places where the cold had settled in and refused to leave. You stood there until the warmth was real. You didn't rush it. Over the following days, Delia settled the way a person settles when they are learning that a place is real and isn't going to reverse itself. She was quiet and careful in her movements, taking up as little space as possible, which Nora recognized from her own early weeks here and gave room to without comment. She didn't crowd, she didn't check in or offer reassurances. She just kept the routine steady and let time do the work that time was the only thing that could do. Delia started helping at the workshop after the first week. She swept and organized and handed tools to Jack during the Saturday classes, and Jack treated her the way he treated everyone, with patient instruction and the dry, precise humor of a man who had been teaching things long enough to know that learning happened when people felt safe enough to make mistakes. He corrected her once during a demonstration and then moved on without circling back to it, which was how he taught. And Delia's hands grew more confident with each session. May started bringing more food. The explanations became more creative. One Thursday, she arrived with an entire pot of soup and told Nora that she'd accidentally made twice what she intended, which was categorically impossible from a woman who had been cooking for 60 years with a precision that bordered on engineering. Delia accepted all of it without comment, and Nora noticed over the course of 2 weeks that she was eating more slowly, less urgent, more present. The hunger that had been written into her posture was beginning to ease. She enrolled in the high school the following Monday. Nora drove her to the building and sat in the car outside, while Delia looked at it through the windshield with the expression of someone deciding whether to climb a wall. "I haven't been in a school in 2 years, Delia said. "I hadn't been in one in 6 when I started studying for my courses," Nora said. "You don't have to figure all of it out today. Just show up tomorrow." Delia looked at her. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Nora thought about Jack's birdhouses and May's soup and Dave running a water line and calling it a scout project. She thought about Mrs. Alderman giving her 5 minutes to sit in a bank office and not asking her to hurry. She thought about the way the town had stood up in that hearing room, not because anyone organized them, but because they'd been waiting without knowing they were waiting for a reason to stand. Because somebody cared what happened to me, she said, and the only way to pay that back is forward. Delia looked at the school building for another moment. Then she opened the car door and got out. On a Saturday in early May, Dale Mercer came through the gate with a girl holding his hand. She was 8 or 9 with dark braids and the serious expression of a child who takes new situations seriously. She wore overalls and boots that were slightly too large for her, and she looked at the workshop with the focused assessment of someone who had heard about a place and is deciding whether the reality matches the description. Dale wore jeans and work boots and a flannel shirt. He looked different than he had either time before the business meeting posture was gone, entirely replaced with something quieter, and he held his daughter's hand with a gentleness that changed the whole proportion of him. "This is my daughter Ellie," he said. "She wants to build a birdhouse." Nora looked at him. He met her eyes without the practiced steadiness of their previous encounters. This was just a man standing at a gate with his daughter, uncertain of his welcome and making no argument for it. "Jack teaches the Saturday class," Nora said. "Third workbench from the left. He's got kits." Dale nodded. "Thank you." He walked Ellie to Jack's station, and Jack handed her a piece of pre-cut pine and a small hammer with the same matter-of-fact ease he brought to everything. Ellie looked at the hammer, and then at Jack, and then at the wood, and set to work with immediate seriousness. Dale stood a few feet back and watched. He stood there for an hour. He watched his daughter tap nails into wood with growing confidence, make 2 mistakes that Jack corrected without drama, and produce at the end of the session a birdhouse that was slightly lopsided on one side, in which she carried out of the workshop with the proud, upright bearing of someone who has made something real for the first time and knows it. Before he left, he stopped at Nora's workbench. "She had a good time," he said. He looked at Ellie, who was examining her birdhouse from various angles near the gate. Then he looked back at Nora, and something moved across his face, the particular discomfort of a person who needs to say something honest and has not said enough honest things in the recent past to have made it a natural habit. "I'm sorry," he said, "about the hearing, about all of it, about what my grandfather did and what I tried to do after it." He paused. "Your grandfather built something that mattered to this town. I should have known better than to try to take what little was left of it." His jaw tightened, not with aggression, but with the effort of saying the next part. "I've known about that lot for a long time. My father mentioned the chamber once said there might be something buried there. I should have left it alone. I told myself it was business." He looked at Ellie again. "It wasn't business." Nora looked at him. She thought about Gerald Mercer standing in a town council meeting in 1961 and saying the right things in the right order. She thought about Dale standing in this lot 6 months ago saying concrete and weeds before she described the surface. She thought about the lumber delivery the morning after the hearing, no name, no ceremony, just good wood stacked neatly along the fence. She thought about Walter's letter. "I just know it was the only one I could see." "I know," she said. She meant it in the full weight of the phrase, not dismissal, but acknowledgement, the kind that actually costs something to give and receive something real in return. Dale looked at her for a moment. Something in his face settled the way a thing settles when it has been held in tension for a long time and is finally allowed to rest. Then he nodded, and he took Ellie's free hand, and they walked back down Tower Road together in the May afternoon, with the birdhouse held carefully between them. That evening, after the workshop had emptied and Jack had gone home, and Delia was at the kitchen table with her homework spread out under the lamp, working through 2 years of missed material, with the methodical focus of someone who has decided that falling behind is a temporary condition. Nora sat on the porch of her house and watched the light go. Scout lay at her feet with his chin on her boot. The air smelled like the first warm earth of spring and the cut wood smell that had soaked into everything on the lot over the past months. Along the fence line where the chain link met the ground, wildflowers had come up through the gravel, yellow and purple, small and determined, claiming the ground the weeds had held for years. She held Walter's journal in her lap. She had read it so many times that the leather was soft at the corners, from handling the pages loose at the spine, where she had opened it most often. She ran her thumb along the cover and thought about the hands that had first pressed these words into these pages, the young hands of a 35-year-old engineer in 1955 who had just been given the best job of his life, and the old hands of an 84-year-old man in 2004 who had driven 9 hours to put a letter in a box for a granddaughter he had never held and would never meet. She thought about Claire, who had run from pain and ended up in a city where nobody knew her name, and had still at some point in a hospital room written a name on a form. Her father's name. The name of the man she had left at 17 and never called, and apparently never stopped being connected to, in the way that you stay connected to the things you run from, even when you tell yourself you have gotten away. That one form, that one name in a box on a hospital intake sheet, that was the thread. It had taken 16 years in a broken down Honda Civic and a $5 bid at a surplus auction, but it had led here, to this porch, to this house, to the workshop on the other side of the lot, where Jack's coffee maker sat between the belt sander and the nails, and where on any given Saturday 11, people were building things they didn't know they needed to build until they started. She thought about Ruth, who had braided her hair every morning and made oatmeal on the stove, and taught her to thread a needle and patch a wall and keep her boots in good repair, who had worked 2 jobs to keep one apartment and had died on a Tuesday afternoon and left behind a 14-year-old who would spend the next 6 years in the system and then 2 years on the road before walking into a surplus auction in a town she'd never heard of and spending $5 she could not afford on a pile of concrete and weeds. She thought about the water still running under the streets of Colton through pipes. Walter Briggs had laid 60 years ago, still doing what he had designed them to do, unchanged and uninterrupted, carrying clean water to every house in town the way he had promised Mayor Harlan it would. She opened the journal to the inside of the front cover. The first thing written there was Walter's hand, neat and deliberate in the ink of a man who had just been given a job and understood what it meant. Walter Briggs, Water Commissioner, Colton, Illinois, April 1955. She sat with it for a moment. She thought about build something stay. She thought about the steel frame of the workshop catching the last light, the way it had been catching it for the past 5 months. Walter Steele doing new work in a new century on the same foundation he had poured by hand in the heat of an August that was now 60 years gone. She reached into her jacket pocket and found the pencil she kept there for measurements and notes on the workbench. She held it over the page. Then she wrote beneath his line in her own hand, smaller than his, less formal, but steady. Nora Briggs Calloway, Workshop, Colton, Illinois, April 2016. She closed the journal and held it in her lap and looked out at the lot in the last of the evening light. The workshop stood quiet in the early dark. The steel frame caught the last horizontal light and held it briefly. Walter Steele, 60 years old and still doing work. Delia's voice came through the window behind her, reading something aloud from a textbook, in the low-focused tone of someone getting acquainted with material that has been waiting patiently for her to arrive. Tomorrow Jack would come and they would start planning the extension to the workshop's east side to accommodate the Thursday evening class that 4 people had asked for, and that Jack had agreed to teach with the air of a man doing a mild inconvenience while clearly meaning to do nothing of the kind. Tomorrow May would bring something she would call leftover soup, and it would be fresh and warm and more than enough. Delia would walk to school for the 3rd week in a row, and she would come home in the afternoon and work in the workshop until dinner. Her hands growing more certain with every session, learning the same things Nora had learned, that the work knew what to do even when you didn't, that the material told you things, if you paid attention, that there was a specific kind of piece available only to people who had made something real with their own hands and could feel it still there when they touched it. Nora looked at the stars coming out above the lot. The same stars she had looked at on her first night here, lying on hard concrete with a tarp overhead, and a dog she had just met pressed against her side. Afraid in the specific way you are afraid when you have run out of places to go, and the only option left is to stop exactly where you are and find out whether it's enough. It had been enough. It had been more than enough. It had been a sealed chamber in a walnut box, and the life savings of a man who had believed against all the available evidence of 60 years that the right person would eventually come and find what he had left for them. She sat on the porch of the house she had built on the land her grandfather had loved in the town that had owed a debt to her name for 55 years, and was in its slow and imperfect and genuinely human way beginning to pay it. She had come from $5 in a broken car and a name she carried without knowing what it was attached to. She had come from Walter Briggs, who poured concrete in August heat and saved bonds month by month and drove 9 hours with a failing heart because he wanted the ground to still give something to whoever came next. She had come from Ruth, who braided her hair and taught her to fix things and left her with nothing except the habits that had saved her life. She had come from a name on a hospital form written by a woman who ran from everything, except in the end, the one connection that mattered. She had not come from nothing. Scout breathed steadily at her feet. The workshop stood quiet in the dark, waiting for morning. Delia's lamp was still on in the kitchen window, casting a small rectangle of light across the cleared foundation where the weeds had been. Home isn't where you're born, it's where you stop running. And she had stopped.